Welcome, everyone. We're absolutely delighted that you came all the way out here. This is a wonderful way to cap off the end of our very first week of classes. On behalf of the Institute of Advanced Study, the Institute of Public Policy, and the School of Humanities and Social Science at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, we are deeply, deeply honored to be hosting Dr. Jose Ramos Horta, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1996 jointly with Bishop Carlos Felipe Jimenez Bello for their work towards a just and peaceful solution to the conflict in East Timor, which is now the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste. For those of you who are perhaps less familiar with the geography or history of Southeast Asia, Timor is a small island at the bottom of the Indonesian archipelago. The Portuguese arrived in the 16th century to use it as a trading post, initially to export sandalwood, and then later on in the 19th century to export coffee as well. At the beginning of the 20th century, Timor was the subject of imperialist conflict, and so the western part was occupied and taken over by the Dutch, the Netherlands, and the eastern half was colonized by Portugal. During World War II, Japan occupied Timor for 3 years, from 1942 to 1945. Our honored speaker was born in 1949 in Dili, the capital of East Timor, and his education really prepared him well for what would lie ahead. He studied international law at the Hague Academy of International Law, human rights law in Strasbourg, and also studied at Columbia University in New York before he ended up returning to East Timor under Portuguese rule at the time to participate in the independence movement. Dr. Ramos Horta was forced to flee to Mozambique from 1970 to 1972, and upon his return, he sided with the pro-independence Freitland faction in the East Timor Civil War. The Freitland gained control of the government on the 28th of November in 1975 and declared Timor-Leste independence. Upon independence, Dr. Ramos Horta was named the foreign minister. However, 9 days later, Indonesia invaded East Timor, and Dr. Ramos Horta was once again forced into exile. Eventually settling in Sydney, Australia, Dr. Ramos Horta joined the faculty of the University of New South Wales and became one of the leading voices for East Timor sovereignty in the international arena. He served de facto as East Timor's ambassador to the United Nations. I read in one of his books that he was living in absolute squalor in New York City in these roach-infested apartments, barely enough money to eat, but he just spent his days and nights walking the halls of the United Nations and addressing the Security Council to anyone that would listen to him. He worked tirelessly and spoke out against human rights violations by the Indonesian military's occupation and promoted a peace plan to end the violence in his country. After receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1996, Dr. Ramos Horta donated the award and prize to a nonprofit organization called Microcredit for the Poor. He returned home in 1999 after the UN Security Council established the UN Transitional Administration in East Timor. Dr. Ramos Horta continued to urge forgiveness and reconciliation and was appointed East Timor's foreign minister in 2000. And he continued to serve in that capacity as foreign minister until after East Timor, Timor-Leste, achieved full sovereignty in 2002. But in 2006, fighting erupted in the country after Prime Minister Mari Al-Khatiri fired hundreds of soldiers who had gone on strike to protest against discrimination. Criticized for his handling of the crisis, then Prime Minister Al-Khatiri resigned and was replaced by our Dr. Ramos Horta, who served as Prime Minister from 2006 to 2007. In May 2007, His Excellency Ramos Horta was elected president, garnering nearly 70% of the votes. The following year, however, he was seriously injured after being shot by rebels outside his home in Dili. Fortunately, he recovered and was able to serve out the rest of his term. Since 2017, Dr. Ramos Horta has served as external advisor to the President of the General Assembly of the United Nations, Dr. Ramos Horta recently published a collection of his speeches and writings in a book entitled Words of Hope in Troubled Times. I'm just going to repeat that title because it's so fitting. Words of Hope in Troubled Times. We could really use words of hope these days, and we are absolutely honored and delighted to have the opportunity to have Dr. Ramos Horta speak to us on challenges in the protection of the rights of refugees and migrants. Please join me in welcoming His Excellency. Before we hand over the floor to you, we would like our university president, Wei Shi, would like to present a souvenir to you.
I'd just like to add a few words. I think many of our students, colleagues, and our friends are coming not only from other parts of the campus, but from other parts of Hong Kong to join. This is a very special day. As Professor Tsai has mentioned, this is our first week of the semester. So I think it's fitting on Friday for us to touch the most important foundation of this university, namely the humanity. Okay, so in that regard, we highly appreciate having this opportunity to listen to the leader of this topic, and I hope we are open-minded, we will listen, we also help find some solutions in our small ways, wherever possible. Okay, thank you very much. What I'm going to present on behalf of all the members of the university is a collection of the ancient maps that's actually collected by our library. Many of these were made by the then missionaries and during the 6th, 17th, and 18th century. Okay, and so it sounds very accurate. On the other hand, it really represents the best effort at the time. So I think this is a small present we would like to present.
I would like to ask Professor Linus, who's supposed to be up here? Right, Hong Kong, and Professor all the focus. Great, thank you. Okay.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the invitation to me to be here today to share with you my thoughts, reflections on a very timely topic. My only fear is that I might be speaking to an audience much more informed about this topic than myself, and therefore might disappoint you. This is the second time I've come to Hong Kong. First time was this year. I've been here numerous times in the past. This year, second time, I was here in April for a meeting of Nobel laureates of sciences. I was the only peace laureate present, and so this and also for a modest launch of my book, Words of Hope in Challenged Times, graciously hosted by the Consul General of Germany in his home. And it was then that I met German Munoz, who, with his esteemed wife, Anne, with their great golden heart, invite me to come again to Hong Kong. So, and from here, the timing was good, because from here I'm going to Bahrain, invited by the authorities there. And then from there I go all the way to Ghana for the funeral of a great human being, I was back home, was speaking with him on the phone at least about 2 weeks earlier to organize our next meeting. I refer to Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the UN, one of the most charismatic and effective Secretary Generals, originally from Ghana. And he was the chairman of the Global Commission on Drug Policies, and I served with him in the commission as a commissioner. And we were discussing rescheduling of our meeting, supposed to be held this month in Beijing. But because the authorities there are going to host a major summit, we consulted with each other, and the meeting was to be held in Mexico City last week of October. And Kofi Annan seemed to be in good spirit, and died tragically, almost exactly 15 years after the death of another great diplomat, Sergio Vieira de Mello. For most of you, might sound totally unfamiliar, but Sergio Vieira de Mello was, at the time of his death, he was the UN Special Representative in Baghdad. He had been appointed High Commissioner for Human Rights, a position he had just took over a few months earlier. He was 2 years in my country, Timor-Leste, as Special Representative of the Secretary General. He went to Baghdad. A month before his departure from Baghdad, he was sent there only for a 6-month mission. One of the first major terrorist attack on a UN institution killed him. That was 15 years ago in August 19. And Kofi Annan, his predecessor, his former boss, also died. Tragic. And another great person. I received an invitation to attend Senator John McCain's funeral, and very short notice on the and physically it was impossible to travel. So this month, past month of August was September, full of memories or tragedies. Maybe for Kofi Annan and John McCain, they have served humanity in their different capacities. So it's, as I shared with you my reflections, I cannot but also help thinking of these 3 extraordinary individuals. Kofi Annan, all his life, since he was in his early 20s, served the UN, particularly in humanitarian field or in peacekeeping, but obviously related to the humanitarian dimension of conflicts. Conflict always have a tragic humanitarian dimension. Sergio Vieira de Mello started about the same age as Kofi Annan, early 20s, all his adult life, having concluded his studies, PhD, at Sorbonne. He did with summa cum laude phenomenology. And then died when the UN, following the US intervention in Iraq, tried to mediate. And then John McCain, you know the history, I will not elaborate. I met him in Washington during my life of work between New York and Washington. I came to know the US Congress like very few people, even I would say very few Americans. I could have written a PhD on the US Congress. And, and I say that because in these current challenging times in the US, if you don't look only at the White House or the news, but look at the dynamics in the US Congress on both sides, Senate and House, you see at play the future of that country and who are the forces of good, who are extra cautious, and who are failing in history. But I will resume my written comments here. My remarks, my formal remarks, I begin with this phrase by Martin Luther King. I think it better than anything encapsulate in very simple words the topic I intend to share with you. I quote, "An individual has not begun to live until he," here I would add, Martin Luther King said, "until he," I add, with bowing to Martin Luther King, until he and she, or she, can rise above the narrow horizons of his, her particular individualistic concern to the broader concerns of all humanity. I begin my remarks with this quote from Martin Luther King, from his memorable speech, "I have a dream." Who has not heard about this extraordinary speech of that great man, Martin Luther King, delivered on 28 August 1963 at the footsteps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. He inspired millions of blacks and whites, Asians and Chicanos, Republicans and Democrats, and propelled many into action. And they together realized a part of the dreams of emancipation of the descendants of the slaves and other excluded peoples. Through the power of nonviolence, reconciliation, and compassion, Reverend King contributed to breaking centuries of the chains of slavery and racism and secure rights that had never before been recognized as human beings, living as free men and women with equal rights and opportunities. Are Reverend King messages relevant today? Are they relevant to the security and humanitarian challenges we face? Are they relevant to the 80 million refugees and displaced persons caused by man-made natural disasters and extreme poverty? Here, when I use the word man-made, I use without hesitation, just use man-made. I'm not going to say woman-made, because tragically, 99.9% of the tragedies in modern times, or even going back in history, made by people like me, like you. Exception, 1, 2, 3, 4 ladies on this row. So here I don't need to be gender sensitive, and just is man-made and natural disasters and extreme poverty. We live in uncertain, dangerous times. We all know that. It's almost like a cliche. The UN is being sidelined, made to look irrelevant, almost bankrupted, almost literally bankrupted by its own member states, by us, so member states of the UN. Multilateralism is being challenged by extremists on the two sides of the Atlantic. Maybe in this case, more by one side of the Atlantic, because the others on the eastern side of the Atlantic, those who challenge intellectual or political pygmies without really major relevance to multilateralism. Because the major powers of Europe, let's say France, UK, Germany, UK, in spite of Brexit, remains fully committed to the United Nations system, to the multilateral system. So one power that matters, we all matter, but one power that matters probably most is one that is not looking upon the multilateralism as serving its interests and the interests of all of us. We are witnesses to the inability of the major powers to end the senseless wars in Syria, South Sudan, Libya, Afghanistan, to name a few. We witness challenges and setbacks to liberal democracy, rule of law, and human rights. Dangerous rise of the political far right and the xenophobia, intolerance, racism, and racially instigated violence. While globally significant progress has been made in the fight against extreme poverty, it continues to afflict hundreds of millions of people in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, causing mass exodus of the poor and the hopeless who venture into dangerous desert tracks and treacherous waters in search of elusive safe havens. And adding insult to injury, inequality has reached a scandalous levels, creating breeding grounds for anger, violence, and instability. We continue to inflict irreversible damage on the only known livable planet, sowing the seeds of the demise of our own civilization. The 2015 Paris Treaty on climate change is not even an overly ambitious attempt to slow down global warming. You know, what was reached in Paris, we all celebrated to some extent, but it was way below what the urgency, the gravity of the situation required. But it was what was possible to negotiate. And it says, in part, holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2% above pre-industrial levels, recognizing that this will significantly reduce the risks and the impacts of climate change. I was there in Paris as a member, part of the least developed countries and of the small island developing states, two institutions that are organized within the UN system and participate actively in the negotiations, representing the most climate vulnerable 600 million people of our planet. Our delegation, my delegation, to COP21, we actively negotiated in good faith with the then US Secretary of State John Kerry and numerous other state representatives to reach the Paris, the historic agreement. And then to our dismay, we saw how even this feeble agreement to minimize global warming was reneged by the world's largest polluter. And I'm deliberately using the word we to mean that we all have a collective responsibility to care for our collective home. But I'm not saying that the Timorese people or the peoples of the Pacific and Indian Ocean Islands are equal scavengers of our planet as the peoples of China, India, Japan, the US, UK, France, etc. We all have responsibility, but we have a proportional responsibility. And in reality, leaders and peoples of the rich enclaves of the world who over centuries have usurped 100,000 times more from Mother Earth do have a far greater responsibility than the billions who for centuries have lived and continue to live on the periphery. And as we continue to be driven by greed and lack of vision to rescue our planet, wars will be fought over arable land and the fresh water. The wars of the future will be fought over water. And this is not even a new phenomenon. Tensions already rising increasingly in the Middle East, in the Horn of Africa, when Ethiopia, where the source of Nile is partly, building a gigantic dam, but probably, I say probably because I'm not a scientist, and even scientists on both sides differ, will severely affect life in Egypt, in the Delta region. A country that for thousands of years, its history, civilization, moved slowly, elegantly along the Nile in Cairo. But Ethiopia, building this dam for the sake of the development of the country, etc., etc. They have said they have done every possible environmental study, but we know how all our best scientific studies in regard to environment turn out to be flawed. And it's happening right now in many parts of the world. The theme of our the theme of our conversation today must probably resonate well with you, some of you, women and men, with kind hearts. Surely you feel some anguish in the heart when you read about the personal stories of fellow human beings fleeing wars and or religious persecution, seeking safety and the freedom from complete destitution. But there are always others who simply shrug. That's human being. And pardon, I'm among you here in the audience. How many, when you look at, if you look at all, on the news of the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, fleeing the Maghreb, North Africa, Syria, to going to Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and then on to Europe. How many of you in this room have empathy and start thinking about what can I do? Or you switch either to your scientific academic papers or to some games, more entertaining. I leave this to you to answer. Because I said, yeah, some simply shrug. I personally, when in the United States, because I lived many years there, not by choice, although I always dream of going to New York. From my little village in Timor, I always, God, I want to go to New York one day. Then I end up in New York by accident of history, not by choice. In the US, obviously, I'm a mixed race in my family. I pass some for Latino. I pass for, often particularly for Puerto Rican. And a friend of mine, a Peruvian sociologist, he was also a diplomat. We chatted, and he said, and we talked about the dangerous risk of riding in the New York subways. And he said, people who, criminals, they study their victims. And I said, I lived in New York 15 years and used the subway day and night. I was never attacked. And he said, Jose, potential criminal, they study their victims. Anyone who look at you, particularly when you're very serious, they don't dare. And you look like a Puerto Rican. And the Puerto Rican, that's his word. Puerto Ricans settle every dispute with a knife. And they are well known in Manhattan, in New York. And so I was very thankful for my Puerto Rican looks. And, but I also part for Arab, for Palestinian, or sometimes for Italian, but probably more from the Palermo island. My extended family is a rich mosaic of skin colors, culture, languages in a country that is literally at the edge of the world, bathed by the great Pacific and Indian Ocean. We are literally at the edge of the world. If Earth was flat, there would be the end of the world. Beyond that, only dark matter. But because it's round, and you go on to the next destination. Legend says that rather than we were product of the clash between the Australian and Asian continents that forced the island of Timor up, the island of Timor was given birth by a crocodile. I have written very few books for lack of time, unlike academics who have plenty of time to, but the most successful best-selling little book I wrote was for children. It was part 1 to be part of 20 parts, and on the birth of the island of Timor. And at the time, it was published in Timor by UNICEF for distribution in our schools. I told at the time I didn't care about copyright, whoever wished to republish. It has been republished in about 16 languages around the world, and I lost control completely. And hundreds of thousands, including during the Shanghai Expo in 2008, I was there. We had a Timor stand, and one of the most successful features of the stand was selling of the book translated into Mandarin. So, and you look, it really looked like, the island looked like a crocodile. I was foreign minister at age 25. Then later, Professor already said a bit of my background. I arrived in New York in the winter of '75. Had never been in northern winter. Had never seen snow in my life, and I didn't have winter clothing. And I was sent there, assigned by our organization, our movement, to advocate the cause of self-determination and hoping to prevent an invasion that we knew was going to happen anytime. I ended up living 24 years in the diaspora. And during that time, I crisscrossed the US. Sometimes by Greyhound bus, Amtrak, sometimes someone's lift, sometimes carrying university somewhere would invite me to speak, particularly those interested in Southeast Asia, and they would give me $100 tip, and I was already very happy. And when at Stanford, a few years later, but still in the same condition, I was given $500. I was completely shocked. But in the end, I couldn't collect the money because there are so much complication with paperwork to cash those $500. I gave it to a Timorese refugee. He went to the United States, to Brown University. I said, listen, if you have a patient enough to get this clear, you can have this check. I don't have the patient. And he was more patient than I. He managed to collect the $500. I travel all over the US, and I imagine myself sometimes like Alex Tocqueville. You familiar? The French aristocrat of 18th century who traveled the US and gave us a book called Democracy in America. And I actually, over the years, I fantasize about, before I would go back to my country, finally, I would like to take a few months, 1 year or 2 years off, and travel in the US and do Democracy in America 2, Volume 2. I never did because by the time conditions were there for me to return, I was not going to wait one more second. And I left. My circumstances of arriving in New York, very different from many who are here in the room, who arrive here in Hong Kong or elsewhere in the world. Because I didn't go to the US with a dream or illusion of getting a job or to study. I was given a specific mission to go to New York to advocate our cause. And that was my first lesson, introduction to the United Nations and the two international hypocrisy and the failures of the system of states. Many often criticize the UN as such, as if all blame is rest on the Secretary General and the people around him. The Secretary General, whether current one, Antonio Guterres, outstanding diplomat, great heart, great human being, or his predecessor, Ban Ki-moon, from South Korea, incredibly energetic. I worked with him over the years. After I left office as president, he invited me to work first as his special representative in Guinea-Bissau, in West Africa, later to chair a UN panel on UN peace operation. He was a workaholic. And sometimes he would give me an assignment that usually takes 2 years. He said, please, can you do it in 6 months? I would tell him, Secretary General, we are not all Koreans. I'm an islander, and we take life casually, easily. And, but we try to deliver to him what he asked of us. And because of my understanding, knowledge about the US, and admiration about that country, because I never judge countries, societies, people through the black and white. In any situation, in any country, you deal with a country, a society, or individuals, there are always nuances. There are always good and bad, best and not so good, etc., etc. And I came to admire the US political system, checks and balance, the incredibly independent, fiercely independent media, particularly like the New York Times, or Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, Boston Globe, and then the more gutter journalism practiced by New York Post. But comparatively, New York Post is not so bad when you compare with a few others. And I have to say, my country's freedom, independence, thanks obviously to the people on the ground, those who never gave up the dream, never surrender. Thanks to the work of international solidarity, we build network all over the world. It was not only in one country, group of country, or one belief, all over the world, including in Indonesia itself. in Asia, in Japan, all over Africa, US, all over the US and Europe, and the governments that were converted to our cause. But Indonesian people were the ones that really brought about changes. When in 97, 98, they went to the streets to protest the 30-year dictatorship of Suharto in the midst of financial economic crisis that affect the region, starting Thailand and then reaching Indonesia. And throughout those years in the United States, I rely more on the US Congress than even on the UN for effecting incremental, slow changes in Indonesia policies towards Timor-Leste. The US Congress has had far more impact on the evolution progress of my country than the UN. The UN took active part only towards the end, when member states like the US and others began to change, like Indonesia began to change. The UN was not the catalyst of changes. Catalyst of change, maybe I would say Indonesian people. The economic financial crisis in Indonesia. It is in this context that when I look today at the way official statements out of the US administration, in the way they refer to migrants, refugees, it is heartbreaking, to say the least. Not long ago, I don't remember when, I was asked by friends in the US to do a letter that was then published in a lot of church organizations around the US around the case of a Mexican gentleman. His name is Jorge Garcia. He arrived in the US at age 10 with his parents, without documentation. For 30 years, he was a model citizen of his community, working as a landscape gardener, raising 2 children with his wife, an American citizen. He had no arrest, not even a traffic ticket. The family spent $125,000 in legal costs to find him a path towards citizenship, no avail. And then, ironically, on Martin Luther King Day, he was forced away from his wife and sobbing children. He was deported to Mexico, a foreign country to him, ripping a father from his family and separating a good man from his children. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in my lifetime, I have dealt with real people, real problems, whether in my own country, whether in the countries I visit, like the United States where I lived, or in Australia. A year ago, I was giving a speech at UNSW, University of New South Wales, precise on refugee and migration. Australia has obviously a much smaller case or dimension in dealing with refugees than Europe, for instance, or even or United States. But it is also a very big topic, political topic, but also a moral topic for many Australians. And I researched some situations, and what I found out through a friend in LA who had been commissioned by NASA to do a series of stories on women working in NASA. they selected 14 women. And when my friend, she was the one who did the stories, she said when she completed the stories, the 14, then they realized of the 14, 9 had been refugees or children of refugees. For instance, a Burmese woman, now age 40-something, she left Myanmar age 14, presumably taken by some American family. The footage shows her extremely poor village where she came from. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that lady, her name is Mimi. She is chief engineer in NASA, developing a helicopter, a mini helicopter, that will fly on planet Mars in 2022, I think. Another survivor of killing fields, Cambodia, working in NASA. Another survivor of the boat people, Vietnam. And one, she was the daughter of a Mexican woman, a house cleaning lady. So these are some of the extraordinary stories of refugees, of migrants. Many, many years ago, I was in Dublin, the Republic of Ireland. An institution called American Academy of Achievements. Somehow, out of the blue, also elected me to be honored. And that year, the meeting was in Dublin. And I was in a round table over dinner, sitting next to some well-known faces. One was Mike Wallace, back then, a great journalist, presenter of 60 Minutes, CBS, US. Obviously, I knew him. But there was a gentleman sitting next to me. I didn't know. I asked him what he does. He said, "Oh, I'm a businessman." And where are you from? He said, "I'm from Australia." And what kind of business you do? He said, "I own the Westfield." And the only Westfield I knew was the one in Liverpool, suburbs of Sydney, where my mother used to, she passed away. When she lived in Sydney, Liverpool, she and other poor Timorese would go to Liverpool just to get the air conditioning. It's cooler there than in our homes. So she would go there. So I only knew about that. So I told him, "So you own the Liverpool Westfield?" He said, "Yes, that one and all the rest in Australia, in the US and UK." I said, "You must be a very rich person." And I asked, "What's your name?" He said, "My name is Frank Lowy, survivor of Holocaust, arrived in Australia without a cent, and one of the biggest, richest men, but also biggest philanthropists in Australia, in the world." So this is the story of many of us, how migrants, refugees contributed to building countries, building economies, and how a refugee, a migrant from Lebanon, a small village in Lebanon, he is the one who saved the New York Times. When New York Times was going to close down, bankruptcy, it was Carlos Slim, Mexican, Lebanese, who bought the New York Times and rescued that great newspaper. So this has been my experience. Ladies and gentlemen, refugees and immigrants do not expect a bed of roses when they finally reach safer shores, wherever they may be. And only God knows what goes on each individual's heart and mind on the day when he or she decide to leave the country. My own country is poor. We have now some more resources because of oil and gas. And even as poor as we are, we have quite a few so-called illegal migrants. I have this enormous difficulty in accepting this word, illegal migrant. And sometimes I use it only because, well, it's the legal definition, I cannot explain a situation, I have to do a full sentence speech. Okay, illegal in a quote. And sometimes driving, and obviously it's a small town, everybody knows me. And I see some people standing on the veranda of a shop. And I like human beings, and I study, I look, and I almost can differentiate between a Bangladeshi and an Indian and a Pakistani. And I see an obvious Chinese gentleman sitting in the veranda. I can tell, no, he is not Timorese Chinese. He is newly arrived. A Timorese Chinese, he sits this way, he sits that way, and so you can. So when I saw them, I thought, these are Bangladesh, and yes, they were Bangladesh. And then why someone from Bangladesh would have come to Timor-Leste? There are better destinations. Well, and then I tell my people, because we have many, thousands of Indonesians, ethnic, newly arrival Chinese, selling plastic flowers, selling shoes, bicycles that break down after 3 weeks. And most of us know now, if I want to buy a bicycle, I'm buying Indonesian bicycle, not Chinese bicycle. And I was walking one day, still dark. Suddenly, I felt something strange on my feet. But because it was dark, well, I just continued. When it was a bit light, after close to 7 a.m., I looked, I had no soles. The sole had disappeared, the sole of the shoes. So I was walking on, literally barefoot. And that was, so we have all of that, but obviously it's no, minimizing Chinese. They produce certain products for certain purchasing power. And the people are happy to buy a pair of shoes for $5 because that's what we can afford. But they also produce Italian or Portuguese quality shoes. But that's what we have in Timor-Leste. We share an increasingly crowded planet with even scarcer resources like arable land and water. In addition, wealth is scandalously unevenly distributed. And this being so, it was inevitable that the legions of the poor living on the periphery would defy treacherous routes and national borders, seeking a better life in the land of the richest. And what is, ladies and gentlemen, the phenomenon of today, of hundreds of thousands, millions flocking to Europe. It is not an extraordinarily new phenomenon. Hundreds of years ago, it was in the reverse direction. Millions of Europeans flocked to what today is South Africa, Canada, US, Central America, South America, Australia, New Zealand. But back then, the planet was less crowded. Back then, there was no social media, global television, and none of us follow that. But today, we see it happening right under our eyes. Because the reasons of people, the populating of US, of Canada, of all of Latin America, Australia, in great part had to do with Europeans fleeing religious wars, fleeing poverty. Of course, there were others who went much later, but those who went much later also, they're looking for better life. The first waves of immigration, let's say, to Australia, from Italians, Greeks, later Lebanese, and then in the 70s, Vietnamese, Cambodians. if you went to Australia today, and if you had known Australia 40 years ago, very different of the makeup of communities. When I was in Melbourne, one of my many visits to Melbourne a few years ago, I met with the mayor of Melbourne. Chinese, obvious feature, Chinese. And he spoke English with Chinese accent. Very distinct, first generation, and he was one of the survivors of Tiananmen. But that also illustrates how Australia changed. 30 years earlier, he would have never been elected mayor anywhere or council's man in a small town. Of how also slowly, whether in Europe, whether in Australia, the contact between different people of different religions, different race, different ethnicities, in the beginning, as it was in Australia, I witnessed with my own eyes, ears, how the first waves of Vietnamese arriving were met with extraordinary hostility, fear. Today, no one talks about the Vietnamese in Australia. They're completely integrated. Now the new fear is Muslims, Arabs. But they forgot that Lebanese and many other Muslims have been in Australia for decades, completely integrated and had very little to do with their countries of origin. But most of them born there. What is necessary is that at university, at the school, here in Hong Kong, in China, in Japan, in Europe, we educate our children, our youth, about humanity. And educate them through the extraordinary, successful experiences of migrants, of refugees who have helped building countries. And in my country, I do my bit. I don't try to save the world if I cannot save my own country. I cannot try to lecture everybody else in my own country. I'm not able to. But we came from, I end with this, as Madame Professor mentioned earlier. We had a 24-year conflict with Indonesia, the largest Muslim majority country in the world. We are 98% Catholic, the most homogeneous Catholic country in the world, more so than Poland in terms of a percentage of population. I don't know whether even the Vatican City has more practicing Catholics than East Timor. And Indonesia, as you know, is one of the largest Muslim majority in the world, one of the greatest promises of democracy in Southeast Asia. We had 24 years under Indonesian occupation, and today, Catholic majority Timor-Leste, Muslim majority Indonesia have the best relationship of any two countries in Asia. I guarantee you, Timor-Leste and Indonesia enjoy better relations than Indonesia and Malaysia. And when I say better relations, it's at two levels: official, government to government, and the people to people. It's not enough for governments to issue proclamations of eternal friendship when at the people's level, either there is no knowledge, no interconnectedness, or because of that, there is even hostility. After the independence of Timor, we had advice, pressure from some countries to set up an international special tribunal to try the crimes of the past, crimes perpetrated by Indonesian military. We declined, we refused as leaders of the country. We said Indonesia itself is in transition from dictatorship to democracy. And like any transition, is complex and fragile. Any new challenge introduced, particularly one that is so divisive as an international tribunal, will exacerbate divisions in Indonesia, and in the end will not serve justice in our country. The Indonesian leadership and society are completely surprised with our attitude. They probably never expected that the Timorese would be so understanding. So Indonesia walked halfway to meet us. And today there are no two countries better relations than Timor and Indonesia. We have thousands of Timorese studying in Indonesia, thousands of Indonesians in Timor-Leste. Timorese passport holder doesn't need a visa to go to Indonesia, and vice versa. And Indonesia is our strongest advocate for Timor to join ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asia Nations. I end my formal remarks here. I wanted to make it very short to give more time for Q&A. If I had strict to my written remarks, probably I would have ended earlier. But I have sometimes this problem. I deviate from my written speech. And in this regard, I have to say I'm very much like President Trump. And thank you.
To 25 minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions for our guests, please raise your hand, introduce yourself very briefly, just a name, and we will get a microphone to you.
Hi, Dr. Horta. First, thank you for the talk. It was great. My name is Vinit Pongshe. I'm a year 5 undergraduate student at HKUST. Something which you said during the course of your talk I found very interesting when you spoke about our responsibility towards the planet. And I would like to paraphrase you. You said that we all have a collective but proportional responsibility, if I'm right. Do you believe that the same thing could be said in terms of the problem for accepting and rehabilitating refugees, which of course is a very relevant problem in today's context? So do you believe, given the current situation, we have a collective but a proportional responsibility towards accepting and rehabilitating refugees? Thank you.
In regard to refugees, to some extent, yes. For instance, who would be most responsible, let's say, for the tragedy in Syria? You know, I don't make politically correct speeches. In Geneva a few years ago, there were 700 people in the audience at the United Nations. I and the former President Martti Ahtisaari of Finland, we both spoke. And for some reason, most questions were addressed to me, partly maybe because they saw that Martti Ahtisaari may be far more diplomatic than I am, so was extremely cautious in his answers. And me, probably less experienced, I was all over the place. So more questions. And one question was that addressed to me on Syria. And I said, I'm not going to make politically correct speeches. Politically correct speeches is you do a very moralizing speech about Syria, and you just repeat what everybody else repeat. No real solution. And I said, I'm sorry, I have to tell you people, I don't see any short or medium-term solution to the conflict in Syria. Sometimes wars go on and on forever. And they end only when parties in the conflict are exhausted. I gave the example of the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s. Remember, more than 1 million people killed on both sides. Chemical, biological weapons were used. There were attempts at negotiations by the UN, by Algeria. Algeria has some of the best formidable diplomats anywhere in the world. ever fail. They finally negotiate when? When the two sides were exhausted. And in the case of Syria and Iraq, it was relatively easy because you were dealing with two organized states. When Saddam Hussein ordered, we end, and Khomeini has said, on, the war ended. In the case of Syria, well, and you know so many agreements in recent times, ceasefire here, humanitarian, and it goes on. Aggravated by neighbors. You know, one cliche in the UN, in our diplomatic language is, like for in Africa, I dealt a lot with the situation of African solutions to African problems. That seemed to make sense. But sometimes our neighbors are the problem. Some of the problems in Africa have to do with neighbors. Congo, DRC, partly has to do with neighbors. And of course, other external powers. Syria, God, you can imagine that besides the internal factions in Syria, more than 100 armed groups. You know how many countries, put aside the US, France, UK, France, time to time threaten Syria, threaten Assad, because probably France still think of itself as a superpower. And nowadays, like the other day, I read about the British sending 2 warships to South China Sea. I thought myself, the leaders in Beijing must have become very scared, nervous about these 2 new warships UK is sending. Instead of dealing with Brexit and the consequence of Brexit, they decided to also get involved in South China Sea, as if we don't have enough weaponry in the South China Sea. And even little Australia. Australia is big in terms of continent, but in terms of population, military size, is modest. Even Australia decided to intimidate China by sending a warship to. So the problem sometimes is the neighbors, but when it comes to addressing people, a situation of people who are victims, and I don't care if those particular victims, I'm not going to ask them when they arrive on my shores, I'm not going to first ask them, what are your loyalties in the conflict in Syria? You know, in my own country, I was president at the time. I visited one of our islands, and one of the local police, he said, we have many Indonesians coming here from the islands next to Timor, no documents, and looking for medical help. And I said something that totally illegal, what I said, but I said, anyway, besides I didn't have the power to say, I said, whenever a human being arrives on our shores looking for water, for food, shelter, medical care, we provide. Later you might ask, brother, sister, where you're from? But our first responsibility is to rescue, to save these people. That's why I say, you know, we all have responsibilities. I was the only president in the world that declined to go to one of the climate change meetings in Copenhagen. You know, that was a complete failure. A, I knew it was a failure. It was going to be a failure. B, hotels in Copenhagen, very expensive. And so I'm not going. So I didn't go. And but what I said, well, we all know who are those responsible. Number one responsible are those who started it earlier, like 100 years ago with industrialization. But are we going to continue in United Nations meeting, conferences, the blame game? Who is responsible? The Americans, the Europeans? I said, no, I'm not going to do that. In my own country, East Timor, in Little East Timor, what we must do? Plant more trees, clean the rivers, the seas, stop dumping plastic in our rivers and our lakes, our seas. Educate our people about respecting environment because we depend on it. So we do what we can do in our own country. I do as an individual what I can do to help a person. And if I'm helping only one, I'm already doing a lot. I cannot solve everybody's problems in a given country, in Hong Kong. But if I help one, I guarantee, if you help one, you will feel this strange happiness enveloping you. My first experience with this was many years ago. I decided to set up a program called Microcredit for the Poor, modeled after Grameen Bank, Mohammed Yunus, etc. I had zero experience on it, but I knew about it. Then I talked to a local NGO. I said, if I give you money, you set up this. They say, yes, they can do it. So, and I would go. The first, I go there and see women coming. And when you look at them, when they first approach the office to seek loan, they look very sad, worried, and then after the interview, they say, you please come back next week. And I always went there to watch. The following week they came to get the envelope with the money. They had already put up a new sarong, a new clean, and they look happier. And as I walk home, because I enjoy walking rather than driving, I felt this a strange happiness. And I thought myself, am I helping them or they are actually helping me? They help you be a better person. They help you being happy. Because this is a real, so I say, we have individual responsibilities as well without any attempt at justifying our inaction because others have great responsibility. I'm sorry, that is false, that is hypocrisy because we don't want to do it. I don't know whether that's what the line of your argument, but if not, please continue and you may ask me again.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for a very detailed response. I'd like to give several more people an opportunity to ask questions. So what I'm going to propose is that we take about 3 questions, that each person who asks a question keep it relatively succinct, and then our guest can decide in what manner he chooses to address those 3 succinct questions. Okay, so raise your hands high. Okay.
Hey there, I'm a freshman from HKUST, and I want to look for opinion about there was tragedy happened in Timor-Leste when Indonesia captured the Timors, and they launched a genocide. I think there was a tragedy happened in your country, and I want to know whether your opinion to the Indonesian or Suharto, the president of at that time in Indonesia.
Okay, next question. Behind you, hand it. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech, Dr. Jose. My question is that I'm sure you remember last week was the 3rd anniversary of Alain Kurdi's death, and I would like to know how you think about how to cause the global citizens empathy and sympathy towards the harsh conditions of refugees and migrants, and what we can do as students to help the global movement towards the protection of refugees.
Thank you. We've got another question here.
Hi there, good morning. Thank you, Professor. My point is, I feel over recent times, due to many, perhaps just isolated events relating to refugees in Europe, I believe popular opinion regarding migrants has been swaying perhaps towards more hostility, whereas this is not the case. It has only been due to isolated events. And this is very unfortunate in the European scenario. How can we bring those people back, sway their opinion back in people's level? So governments can take the posture of welcoming refugees, but how can we make that those people from those perhaps member states of the European Union agree to this because of this? Thank you.
Okay, and then one final question from one of our co-organizers at Bright Hong Kong.
Well, thanks a lot, Mr. Ramos Horta, for a very sort of morally stimulating speech. My question is Africa and Europe. How can Europe prevent the next refugee crisis looming in Africa with the failed states and situations that unfortunately cause refugees to risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean?
I'm just going to take one more question because, and then I'll give you 10 to respond, okay? Just in whatever order or combination you wish.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. We are very happy for your wonderful presentation. I think it is very good. We also talk something about Hong Kong, since Hong Kong has also related challenges that you are addressing now. According to the record, the acceptance rate in Hong Kong is very low, which it is very big challenge that something need to be, talk about it. And I hope maybe many of you are not aware of the challenges that asylum seekers are going through in this city. And getting this opportunity, I think it would be good if some of these stories are told, because many asylum seekers have been here for over 10 years. And then their situation has just been anything that it seems no progress has been made, and then people are living in limbo. So since you have the opportunity to come to Hong Kong, I think it would be better if we can also, hear the story of Hong Kong. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that question home to us. Okay, you have approximately 10 minutes to respond to any portion, either, abstractly, in principle, or specifically empirically. The floor is yours. Thank you. Oh, or you have a mic right there.
Oh, sure. I apologize. Some of the two or first questions I really didn't understand, I think because of your Hong Kong accent. And I would say also, many people do not understand my accent. Years ago, I have a good friend, and he's still alive, more than 90 years old, and still rigid, solid, a former Australian senator from Western Australia, Gordon McIntosh. He's been in Australia since the 50s, and he still has this heavy, unintelligible Scottish accent. And when I talk with him, I say, Gordon, you are the only white person speaking English and I don't understand. So I'm also not used to, sorry, you in the very back, are you from Hong Kong? From? Oh, Korea, yeah, sorry. Anyway, so, Madam, did you understand the question? Can you? But I start with the last one about the European refugee migration. I have traveled across Europe over the years. Every European country I visited, with the exception of Central Eastern Europe, I didn't visit all. And I was recently in Berlin for almost 8 days, and met for 1 hour with Chancellor Merkel. And I was in many places in Berlin. One day, my friend was accompanying me. He pointed me the biggest, most expensive, biggest store. I call it. These. God, how you call it? These big stores, shopping malls, shopping mall. And he had to do something, and I said, okay, let me drop me in the shopping mall. I want to see what is that. And I was surprised, pleasantly surprised, that in Berlin, the heart of Germany, I saw German people seemed to be German, and many others. Then I saw some Muslim women coming in, and with veil, completely covered. With their children, they were not covered. And no one paid attention to them. Everyone there in a big shopping mall going about their business. And this happened in many other parts of Berlin that I visited. Of course, in another part, another friend, a medical doctor, lived. It's a very troubled area. But he said that troubled area goes back already 20, 30 years. Sometimes even the police doesn't want to go there. Like it happened in many other big cities around the world, you know. Talk about, let's say, Brazil, you know, Catholic majority country. With due respect to my friends in Brazil, some of their cities, some areas of there, I don't dare to go, at least alone. In Spain, I was there when I was there a year ago, walking in Barcelona, in the street, walking in Madrid, and I saw the mingling of so many different people, including people obviously either from North Africa or the Gulf region. Totally relaxed. And I told to friends of mine, God, if this is happening all over Spain, all over Europe, I'm very happy. Much better than what you read in the news from afar. Obviously, the so-called integration is always a difficult process. You know, even ourselves, you know, myself, arriving in New York, I was the one who found New Yorkers unbearable. They didn't care about me. I was totally unknown. But I said, God, these people are all neurotic. Also, I was the one who had prejudice about them, not them about me. So each of us have difficulties in both ways, adapting to a situation. So this process takes, particularly when you have so many people coming because of the tragic situation. Well, I have to say, you know, I hope the Nobel Committee next month, when they make the decision who will get this year, 2018-19, the Nobel Peace Prize, it will go to Angela Merkel. Why? In these challenging times of polarization in Europe and the US and elsewhere, I have to say, Angela Merkel, this simple woman from former GDR, German Democratic Republic, very religious person. Her husband is a great scientist, professor. She is the one who has shown real moral leadership and political courage. She opened the door to more than 2 million people from across Middle East, particularly Syria. And Germany is a big country, but not so big. Population 80 million. And yet she did. And she did for two reasons. Primarily two reasons. One, if Germany, the wealthiest country in Europe, the strongest, with their history that we know, were to turn their back on the refugees, would be a betrayal of the values of the history of Europe, the founding principles of the European Union, because it would have profound consequences for Europe. The other reason, well, Turkey was holding at least, is still holding, at least 2 million refugees. And I was in Lebanon, I was in Jordan. Well, this fragile country, this poor country, Lebanon, probably today have half of the people there. Populations in Lebanon is about to normal Lebanese population, that very mixed, maybe 5 million. And Lebanese themselves don't know how many refugees are there. Officially, maybe 2 million. And you know, the Lebanese are a very divided country. Each Lebanese has his own belief, his own 19 or 20 religions recognized in Lebanon. And yet they managed to maintain that country open, tolerant. But in the Jordan, economic, social difficulties, they host hundreds of thousands of refugees. And then Europe would close its doors like Hungary doing and Austria doing, 2 people fleeing war. So it could provoke the unpredictable Erdogan, President of Turkey. He said, I have had enough. I'm opening my gates of Turkey, let them go to Europe. Merkel, in doing what she did, that was not understood by the extreme conservative elements in her country, not understood by Hungary and others. She bought time and then managed to get the Europeans together and decide to help more Turkey. $10 billion to help her, and agree on a process whereby people who are not identified as genuine refugees would be sent back to Turkey. That she shows an extraordinary. At the same time, we know Europe is very much an aging country. Portugal has one of the lowest demographic growth in the world. So is Spain, a bit less, maybe Italy. France is one that with more almost normal population growth. I stand ready to be corrected if my data is not right, etc. And I have been reading the newspapers. Major companies in Germany having had difficulties getting apprentices for the factory, for the companies, they are recruiting Syrians and Iraqi refugees. Thousands of them are now working in German production lines. So these people, like many other before, will be great contributors to the economy, to the society, wherever they are from. I think sorry if I didn't.
I didn't say anything yet. No, I think you ended on a very encouraging note, actually, by mentioning the leadership shown by Angela Merkel, as well as the creativity of the business sector in incorporating refugees into their society as a source of employment. I understand that given the limits of time, it would have been impossible for you to give thorough answers to each of the questions raised. But what I'm most grateful for as Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences is that you have enabled us to start our year by inspiring really thoughtful questions among our students. And more than anything else, we're not here to necessarily provide answers, real hard, fast answers to questions, but to inspire and motivate our students to keep asking questions and come up with the right ones. And I feel like some of the most important ones have been posed and motivated by your remarks about what can we do as local citizens, what can we do as students, as educators, as citizens of the world, as either members of government or not, members of society. So I think, with that in mind, I'd just like to thank you so much for helping us think about the most important issues facing people around us at this point in time. Thank you so much.
Maybe.
And there will be a book signing, Words of Hope, outside this in a moment.
Those whose questions I didn't answer, because like in your case, my friend from Korea, feel free to go to my website or Facebook page. You can leave there a message, and I will promise I will answer that question that I didn't answer. So feel free. It's easy to find my my website. It's www.ramoshorta.com, and something like that.
Okay, great. Thanks again.